Resident Evil 4 Remake is a terrific game. As the title, Resident Evil 4 Remake balances survival horror scares and action game set pieces with skilled finesse, and is a loyal remake that complements and enhances the strengths found in the original title. And for reasons that I will soon get into, I love it. Yet, with that being said, the necessity for a remake of Resident Evil 4 has been hotly debated. See, after the success of Capcom's more recent Resi remakes, particularly the great Resident Evil 2 remake, though admittedly I did think Resident Evil 3 Remake was still fairly solid, there was ample discussion over whether or not a remake for Resident Evil 4 was necessary. After all, the Resident Evil games prior to 4 had incredibly dated fixed camera angles and other clunky controls that allowed those titles to feel transformative when they ultimately received the remake treatment, whereas a potential Resident Evil 4 remake would hit differently. See, the original Resident Evil 4, which released in 2005 in the Nintendo Gamecube, God, what an underrated console, overall revolutionized the Resi formula and thus became one of the most influential games of its era and genre by having an over-the-shoulder third-person camera perspective that further immersed the player into the game's intense survival horror action, which forever changed the way in which future Resident Evil titles would be designed. Thus, Resident Evil 4 established a gold standard as to what a great Resident Evil game could be. And for that reason, many gamers and fans believed that a potential RE4 remake was unneeded. After all, it's a classic title and one that had a control scheme that was comparatively more modern than the controls within the first Resident Evil games. And from this perspective, a remake of RE4 was just unnecessary. But here's the thing, these gamers are wrong, like gamers are about a lot of things. Mostly because the original Resident Evil 4's controls are kinda shit. Because let's just be honest here. While sure, Resi 4's controls and camera perspective were incredibly influential in the survival horror and action game space back in the day, they really have not aged like fine wine or Paul Rudd. Instead, those said controls have become janky as hell. See, in the game, you can't shoot your gun while moving, aiming your weapon requires you to stand still, and when aiming that said aforementioned weapon, you have to use the left stick, which makes these controls feel dated and frustrating due to how they limit the player's movement. And if anything, those controls are counterintuitive, seeing as Resident Evil 4's gameplay is centered around that aforementioned movement. Like oftentimes in the game, the player needs to run away from enemies in order to find a better vantage point. Yet the inability to move while aiming, the fact that aiming your gun requires you to stand still, and when aiming your weapon, the game makes you use the left analog stick instead of the right one, i.e. it's pretty much the opposite of what most games do these days, is all very clunky and doesn't really complement Resident Evil 4's emphasis on movement. If anything, it detracts from it, because truly the controls are just that bad. And while sure, you can customize the controls on the PC version, and the 2007 port to the Wii arguably has the best controls on console, because you aim your weapon using the Wii's motion controls rather than using the left stick, this is not necessarily a winning argument. After all, if the Wii version of a game has the best controls, that's more of a condemnation than anything, because if the Wii version is the superior version, that game is fucked. Because a Wii version shouldn't be the best at anything. So yes, Resident Evil 4's controls aren't all that great, which is why, in my humble opinion, the newly released Resident Evil 4 Remake has merit. Given that Resident Evil 4 Remake is a reimagining and retelling of an old game but on new hardware, Capcom had the opportunity to recapture what made the original a classic to begin with, all while modernizing the control scheme and the visuals, and thankfully Capcom succeeded with Resident Evil 4 Remake, because it is overall very good, mostly because the remake enhances the original sense of balance. See, the original Resident Evil 4 balanced many disparate elements into a way that was harmonious. It mixed survival horror, terror, and action game traits with finesse. Its narrative about lead protagonist Leon Kennedy searching a rural Spanish village for the president's daughter amid a parasitic zombie outbreak, the one named Las Plagas, was filled with both horror and camp, i.e. it was balanced that way, and the gameplay itself was fine-tuned to where the player is regularly rewarded as they slowly but surely upgrade their arsenal through the merchant, i.e. video game history's most quotable NPC, because what are you buying? And all of these things allowed the original Resident Evil 4 to feel like a finely tuned experience. It was balanced, like Thanos, but without the genocide, and thankfully Resident Evil 4 Remake champions and improves that aforementioned balance, and in most areas the game is either the same or even better. To explain why this is, let's start with Resident Evil 4 Remake's gameplay. See, the remake still delivers the pulse-pounding tension and action game thrills that were present in the original. In fact, like the older game, game, the remake gives you more ammo and weaponry compared to its predecessors. And make things even better, the level design is a lot bigger and more elaborate, which hypothetically tips the power balance into the player's favor. After all, compared to previous Resi Remake titles, the player has more firepower, more ammo, and more space to maneuver. And on paper, Resident Evil 4 is easier. But that's not necessarily the case, because this newfound sense of power is offset by the amount of enemies present on screen. In fact, in Resident Evil 4 Remake, it's really easy for large quantities of infected Las Plagas to overwhelm the player, as if they were attending the front row of Baby Metal's 2016 show at Chicago Open Air. Which, if you were present at that show, then you'd know how tight and compact that experience was. But anyway, the point. Resident Evil 4 Remake swarms the player with adversaries, and that's even before we discuss the tougher enemies like the burlap sack donning, chainsaw wielding maniacs that look as if they are auditioning to become a Slipknot hype man. There's the regenerating enemies, and of course multi-stage boss battles. There's a lot of enemies here, and all these dangers and hostiles combine to emphasize a point. They highlight how the player must incorporate movement into their gameplay strategy. They champion the idea that the player must often run away from these hostiles, regroup, create space, and fire a few shots, and then often run away again and repeat the same process, which as far as gameplay loops go is very impressive, most because that said gameplay simultaneously embodies exciting, thrilling action and horror-filled tension. After all, in this game, you generally cannot stand still and just overpower all of these enemies with your admittedly impressive firepower alone. It is imperative that you move, lest you be carved up by a chainsaw man. No relation. And this tension and exciting action is just something that Resident Evil 4 Remake just does flat out better than the original. After all, as stated before, in the original, the combat was very stop and go due to its controls and movement restrictions. And then to add on to the fact, there was the whole inventory issue where you often needed to pause mid-combat and open up your inventory a lot in order to change weapons, items, and such, which was a problem in the original because for a game that prioritized movement, there were a lot of stoppages there. But thankfully, Resident Evil 4 Remake minimizes the gameplay's stop-and-go nature. It allows you to move while aiming. You aim your weapon with the right stick. And yeah, I get that's a very basic modernization, but it's still an improvement nonetheless. And then there is the ability to swap through pretty much all of your weapons and many of your items via the D-pad, which keeps the game's action and momentum going forward in a way that is both invigorating and modernized. And thus, Resident Evil 4 Remake is an absolute joy to play. It is riveting. Additionally, the story is balanced as well. Like the original Resident Evil 4, the remake tonally mixes and matches survival horror tension with fun and humorous camp, because bingo. Sure, Resident Evil 4 Remake has terrifying scares, but it remembers to have a lot of fun and charm through its character development, especially between Leon and Ashley, as well as having interesting lore and a rogues gallery of eccentric villains, which is always cool. And while sure, admittedly, more recent mainline Resident Evil games have done a better job when it comes to their world building and lore, it is important to remember that the original Resident Evil 4 set the standard though. It was the planted seed to which future Resident Evil games could grow from. And from that angle, Resident Evil 4 Remake recaptures the magic of the original's narrative perfectly. It showcases why the original set the bar in this area. Resident Evil 4 Remake is also paced exceptionally well. With regularity, the game throws new enemy types at the player. There's some thrilling and terrifying action and horror set pieces, intuitive boss battles, and sections that involve protecting or even playing as Ashley, which are things that fundamentally alter the way in which the player approaches combat. There's just a lot of variations in the gameplay throughout all 16 chapters of the title, and that's even before we discuss Leon's arsenal of weapons that can be accrued throughout the game. Weapons that can be slowly but surely upgraded through the lovely merchant, i.e. the guy that looks like he's about to rob a stagecoach, all while appearing fabo. And this is very satisfying, mostly because the player feels notably stronger as they make their way through the game. And while sure there are stronger enemy types that are regularly introduced, because the game still has to ratchet up the challenge here, there are moments later on in the game where the player can lay waste to the weaker enemy types that gave them trouble earlier in the game. And that's just fantastic character progression. It's a clear strength. However, there is one problem with the game's progression system, mostly in the form of microtransactions. See, Every weapon has a bonus attribute that can be unlocked when the weapon is fully upgraded, but the microtransactions allow the player to bypass that requirement and actually purchase the upgrade by itself, which honestly sucks. After all, Resident Evil 4 Remake didn't need pay-to-win microtransactions. The upgrade system is already rewarding by itself, so it begs the question, why would Capcom want to undermine its own game, also that players could potentially pay for glorified cheat codes? Why would Capcom want the player to bypass one of the most satisfying aspects of the game? It's just terrible and greedy. And to make matters worse, Capcom knew that these microtransactions were even more shit than a Kid Rock concert where Kid Rock plays original songs by Kid Rock, because no one should want that shit, because clearly Capcom knew that they were doing a no-no. After all, the company waited until a few weeks after launch to update the game with these microtransactions, meaning that the company did not want their money-grubbing shit covered in advanced reviews or in the strong word of mouth for the couple of weeks following launch day, i.e. the most important window of a game's release. They knew what they were doing sucked balls. Kind of like the aforementioned Kid Rock, if Kid Rock was self-aware, which he isn't. And due to their avarice, Resident Evil 4 Remake is by default a worse game than when it originally launched. By technical definition, it is a lesser game than when it released, which is sad. It's unfortunate. With that being said though, Resident Evil 4 Remake is a great game. Bullshit microtransactions aside, Resident Evil 4 Remake is a fantastic remake of a classic game that modernizes the control scheme in a way that emphasizes the strengths inherent to the original game. It is a literal blast to play and is just an experience I easily recommend both to folks who either have or have not played the original game before. I love it, and to quote the merchant, I'll buy it at a high price. And with that, that was the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like rating, share, subscribe, ring the bell, and leave a comment telling me what you thought of Resident Evil 4 Remake. Also, please consider checking out my Patreon page. $1 a month gets you onto this credit sequence, and $5 a month allows you to make a quick review and impressions requests. The link to my Patreon is in the description. And speaking of Patreon, I just want to thank my patrons, particularly my high tier ones in Samantha Devlin, Mom, and Morgan. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.